Alrighty, good evening and welcome to Nycos Nightly. I'm your host, Jonathan Albin, Game Master Jay, and we're going to be talking about Nycos RPG and about roleplay games in general, as well as some information on the Launchpad in particular. Today we're going to be looking at, first of all, the 9 forms of magic on Nycos. Now, the world of Nycos is an adventure realm that is been pretty much continually inhabited by player characters for 49 plus years. I've been GMing since 74 and have been running an average of 1 game session per week for that entire duration. Now, roleplay games, as they exist, have always had issues with the way magic works, and in the case of traditional Dungeons and Dragons, there are fundamentally 2 ways of dealing with magic. You have divine magics and arcane magics. Later years, and then in the most recent times, they've expanded that to include warlock magic users, sorcerers, to be separate, and the ways in which they gather their spells and develop them and use them changes. And in fact, the use of musical magic in the form of bards has also been differentiated from the other forms. And this has been to add variety, but it's done more to add confusion than anything, because many of the spells are found on multiple lists. And this is really because most players want to have some say in the way that their magics work. And it's difficult to include this concept when you are trying to create new materials for players, because they get into their minds the way they think it works from another system, and it makes it difficult for them to free their imagination in new systems. So today I want to talk about the 9 magics of Nycos. I think I've got actually more than 9 here: 3, 6, 9, 10, 11. And some of them have some crossover, certainly, and some of them are sort of mirrors of others, and I think you'll see how this works as we go. The first one we're going to talk about is the Pantheon of Phalan. And Phalan is a colloquial and Nycos term for the elemental planes, and not elemental, not planes in the sense of living locations, but in order to represent the sources of the power that the PCs have in the game. They call upon Fuerga, Amba, Limbra, Ava, and Nata, or FALAN for the acronym. And these represent fire, earth, air, and water, and the middle one, Limbra, of the very nature of magicals or magic material itself. This is because of the early studies that were done by wizards and sorcerers on the world of Nycos to consider how magic worked, and it was realized that that the solar body Nimbus generates mystical energy and that permeates the entire surface of the planet. So any place where the light touches, as Simba would say, gets to the creatures and beings and very nature of the world. The Pantheon of Phalan, therefore, is very crude magics. Generally, it is the calling or controlling of elementals or elemental powers. So if you were calling down a column of fire, or you were calling up a wall of air, or whatever, then the order of Phalan is the methodology for getting there. Now, there are nuances to this, of course. The order of Phalan also embraces the idea of the miasma, or the field of materials that don't fit specifically into any one of these 5. And this cloud permeates, theoretically, all of being, and therefore is the conduit for your access to the elementals and such. That are not elemental in the stance that a mortal being could live there, or even very often traverse there, because the amount of energy to keep your form coherent in a place of pure energy or pure material like this would be impossible. The second of the orders that we're going to talk about today, the second form of magic on Nycos, is the Pantheon of the Veils. And while it is much more esoteric, much more, as the saying seems to go these days, nuanced, the player, the persona who is generating the magics has more control, if you will, over it than they would otherwise. And the very nature of it is associated with the order's various philosophies, and we have been going over those throughout the last couple of months. And so there's a link here for the Order of the Veils videos, and you can associate and watch those to kind of catch up on the backstories for those. And we'll be doing more as we go by to share more information on this and the other pantheons. Just understand that the Order of the Veils is very open to player interpretation in terms of how their magics work, and so people who tend to play into the Veils tend to play into multiple or all of the orders simultaneously for their magics. The third of the orders is the Pantheon of Makers, and the Pantheon of Makers refers to not only those that create items that have magical propensities, but also the means by which magic can be imbued into items that are by their nature not necessarily magical. This will include the Order of the Brush, which deals with the adornment of things where you actually paint the magics on, or the concept of the Order of the Chisel, which has to do with the sculpture or even rune questing. And the Pantheon Makers spans literally any created item. So fundamentally, any one thing or any group of things could be made magical, and the means by which you would do that is to utilize the Order of Makers, the Pantheon of Makers, to choose which is the most appropriate methodology. So even just the sheer carpentry, the construction of things can make it magical and such. And there's no real limit to the possible materials that you could imbue in this fashion, and the more powerful you become, the more effective your magic becomes, and the more longer lasting it is. In the Pantheon of the Crossroads, we are talking about the magics of dealing with the crossover lands between the other dimensions. While Crossroads is deemed to be a dimensional place, many of the physical characteristics of the modern, of the real world, so to speak, do manifest there. But the Pantheon has to do with spiritual transit, spiritual access, the concept of being able to speak with those who have passed on, or accessing their knowledge and such, would fall under the Pantheon of the Crossroads. Then, of course, you've got the Psychomancers, and Psychomancers are those who utilize their mental powers in terms of magical effects, and these would be what would in other game systems perhaps be called the psionicists. And that means these persona are actually drawing upon the power of their mind to do things that are normally not permitted. So seeing into extra spaces, remote viewing, the concepts of telepathy, telemetry, telekinesis, and so on. There's all of these different ways that you could use your mental powers for magical effects, and they are all collectively put in the category of psychomancy. This does go to even the dark side of control and domination of spirits. So psychomancer tends to get a bad reputation, and being called a psycho is actually referring generally to the psychomancers, those who are using mental powers to do mystical effects. The next are the technomancers, and these are those that have raised the level of technology to the point of magical effects. This includes, for example, the concepts of robotics or constructs, mystical constructs, has to do with the use of long range communication, long range visuals, and so on, as they are actually generally communication that is done in different ways given a magical effect. So a farseer is fundamentally a mystical version of a telescope, and like that. The pantheon of chiromancy is one that's rather unique to Nycos, and that is that a spellcaster has the ability to use the material components of a being once it has passed on and no longer has a spiritual content. So therefore, the idea of utilizing the bones in particular to do magic, where you can actually, it sort of indirectly comes from the idea of being a chiropractor, in that you are utilizing knowledge of how the bones join together to create artifacts and devices that are constructed out of this particular rather grisly material component. And while it does sometimes draw upon the darker forces, generally speaking, it isn't. It's referring to things that are perhaps even on the edge of being petrified or calcified to the point of being stone. The next, of course, are the chronomancers, and these are people who dabble in issues of time. While the obvious ones would be actual time travel, that's far rarer than you might find otherwise. They do tend to manipulate timing and situations and sequences and befuddle and confuse people through mystical powers, utilizing their ability to walk through from one time to another. But generally speaking, it's not a life of Back to the Future, so to speak. Instead, it's the idea of trying to maintain the continuity of the time frame and preventing those from preventing persons from doing evil to the timeline by, going back and murdering their parents or whatever. Then the next, of course, are the Lexicomicon, and these are the people who have studied the mechanisms and the methods for magic, and instead of emulating or replicating the very powers that cause the magic to work, they are duplicating the rituals and the hand gestures and such. And so they are very legalistic in their way of doing magics, and a person who is the members of the Lexicomicon tends to also ascribe to the idea that every item, every being, everything in the world has a unique name, and the knowledge of that name can affect the item directly. So the next, of course, are the pantheon of the Feyre, and while this is a singular connection to one of the other dimensions, the pantheon of the Feyre is actually calling upon the mystical powers of beings from beyond this world that are living in what is considered to be the Fey realm under the leadership of an organization known as the Feyre. And these magics, of course, are generally rather wild and chaotic in nature, generally having to do with living beings, growth, expansion, and the like. We have a commercial coming up, so I want to try to get done with this part and be ready to move on. The final form we're going to talk about here are the gimbal wrights and engineers, and these are people that technically find out how to use counterbalances, levers, fulcrums, and such to cause living things to form out of non-living material. And we'll go more into this after the break. I want to thank you for watching with us so far. If you like what you see, go ahead and follow the channel here on Twitch, and also give us a like over on YouTube at Nycos RPG and make sure you click on the bell there so you can get your notifications when new videos are uploaded. We'll be going to break in about 13 seconds, and so I want to thank you again for being here. And for more information, always check out nycosrpg.com and www.nycosrpg.info. All right. So I don't know if we're off a break yet, but we'll find out here in a minute. We are going to talk next about distribution of magic items in your game adventure world. The very concept of how magic works within a game is generally a anchor point for development of the story going forward, and therefore it's important for the game master to kind of have a moderate control. Now we're still on commercial break. Alrighty, we are back from commercial, it looks like, and so right now we're talking about the Game Master's Toolbox and the distribution of magic items in your game system or game world. When you are a storyteller and game master, one of the pieces of the puzzle that tends to get out of hand fairly rapidly is the promotion and advent of magical items and the impact they have on the game. Many of them are built to be stackable, which means that the modifiers of one item should be able to interact with or modify die rolls in a particular characteristic. So, for example, weapons normally have a modifier to the attack roll or the defense value. Maybe an item of healing will have to do with the speed at which somebody recovers and the like. So it's sometimes difficult to learn how to gauge those mechanisms. We're going to talk today about some of the means and methods to do so. The first one is to consider that many of the magic items that are actually created in any game world are fundamentally trinkets and baubles. These are things that people make because magic is a personal art, and therefore they will create items that suit their purposes and perhaps their purposes only. I'm reminded of a persona in one of my games who created a toothpick dispenser that would create new toothpicks. Now, ultimately, it created a religion and its own faction in the world of Nycos, but for the most part, items like the toothpick dispenser are cast offs, and therefore the party will occasionally find magic items that have mystical powers, and they can even be rather strong ones, but they're generally found to be in difficult to use or odd items that perhaps lose their luster over time in the minds of the players. Of course, there are also those items where the players are introducing the magics. They have done something to create an item or imbue an item or provide a methodology for charging an item and therefore altering its outcome. And these are arguably better and easier to use because you, as a game master, are exclusively focusing it on that particular player. What you'll find is that the magic items that generally cause difficulties are those that are considered to be generic items. The fantasy realms under the Dungeons and Dragons realm, for example, has real difficulties with these because many of them do indeed stack, do indeed give their numeric values combined effect, and therefore make it difficult to control how the players are interacting with the game because you've provided them with the very properties by which they can ignore your game rules and your session mechanics. This is also tied directly to what I call the impermanence problem. In any world where magic, in essence, exists, for the most part, the stories of the magic's effects are short-lived or have a limited duration. Of course, there are items also that are played into the story that have a legacy effect, for example, artifacts and such. But the problem of impermanence tends to get rid of much of this by simply limiting it out of existence. So if the personas in the game are told that you cannot create an item that can last more than a month without possible damage to your own health, the people will second guess whether or not they want to go through that effort. And again, the concept of creating an item that's permanent for a given player. This is actually kind of appealing because then it gives a reason for a player to continue a story with a new persona once his primary persona has achieved a retirement age, so to speak, because he can hand down his legacy items to the next generation of players. The biggest, the actual biggest challenge with magic items in a game is the misuse, and abuse of magical effects by players who arguably have more time than a game master to be reading up and determining what the actual mechanical effects of a given set of items will be, and so they can create combinations and mechanisms that allow the numbers to be even more devastating in their ability to combo an effect. So it's important to learn how to counteract that in your rules development as you are creating magic items too, so that you build in an obsolescence, you build in a time for the property to lose its luster, and you give it the ability to become magically accessible, but not overpowered. And there are several different ways to do this. You can reduce the overall effect by some number. You can cause the effect to only have an effect on certain targets. You can only make it available at certain times of day and such like. But I found, though, the most effective way of handling this is to create multiple methodologies for magical resource within the game so that the game master has control over what magics are available at a given place, and they simply can run out, they can be reduced. Monsters could have come in and taken them. There's 1,000 different ways that you can cause the magical resource that the players depend on to become more scarce, and thereby force them to endeavor to play into the adventure at a higher level and perhaps pursue their own resource chains. And Another way to do this also is to create the idea that your relics, your artifacts, your ancient weapons of power are the only ones that have an imbuement. The concept of a low magic environment where the items are the only things that have any mystical power does lend itself to that, and therefore the players have to spend time in game discovering how these effects would work and how to manifest them. And the the final kind of straw that gets laid on the camel's back is the concept of the value of a magic item that's been created and how that would affect the free market economy of a game world. If a certain player character becomes an industrial producer of magical swords, granted, he's going to make a lot of money, perhaps selling to various military factions, but ultimately that may lead to a civil war, which will therefore radically increase his number of sales, but decrease perhaps the profitability because everyone will have access to them. So the idea is that you have to establish a market value for items and then figure out what the players are allowed to do in terms of creation to balance that out and make it so that the players' functions are still to play the character in the game and not to become just industrial producers in a fictional uh, torture chamber of life like we live in. I'm just kidding. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about is I'm going to go over again for you the components of the Launchpad. We've talked about each one of them separately, but now I kind of want to draw a bow around it and bring them all back together. Each of the elements of the Launchpad are useful tools with multiple functions. They act in different ways at different times, and they connect together to make a really useful, life-changing, transforming engine, if you will. So we're going to talk about, of course, the Launchpad itself. It means you're going to be experiencing life beyond the sphere. You're not going to be limited to what you currently have or currently can perceive, but now we're going to open your mind and expand the possibilities to new places you haven't gone before. We're going to utilize life lenses, these paradigm measuring tools that allow you to assess where you are in compared with the goals that you have and how to determine whether you are spinning your wheels or whether you are actually progressing towards your objective. We're going to be, of course, focusing on the use of chain storms because the chain storms are the way that the mind works to not only build the basic steps of progression, but also to build out the timing sequence and the chronology of things so that we get an idea of prioritization. And this prioritization is critical to our success because if we do not understand what needs to be done first, second, third, fourth, and so on, we will work on pieces that either are not in the numeric sequence at all or are in the wrong order and therefore leave us feeling frustrated. So this prioritization process, of course, depends on another of the Nycos Launchpad tools, and that is the idea of lucid visioning. And while this sounds like we're talking about just a dream world, what we're referring to is the ability to transfer meaning from our world into the dream world or the fictional place, and therefore put quantifying numbers on it so that we can see that progression going forward. We're also going to talk about clearing the decks, and that is getting rid of any of the chaff in our lives at any given moment. One of the greatest tools in this entire process is this, and that is the idea that when you get muddled and when you get confused, you can perform basically an instant reset and bring yourself back to a center place, and from there begin to build again. Even if you've lost some ground, you're still going to get back up and moving. The next, of course, is the domino principle, and this is where the transition protocols and the chain storm come together. The domino principle is that you are building your future by imagining the working elements of your future all at the same time. And as you build towards your objective and lean into the successes that you do have, you will create a cascade of events that will make you inevitably more successful than you are and allow for the change, the transformation that you began in the transformation protocols to actually move forward within radical, realistic renovation to become the new normals for your life. And then finally, we want to talk about the clarified terms. And that is, even in this case, we have a vocabulary that we have built so that you, as a viewer, participant, and a player, can actually start to progress your own skills in your own terms and at your own time rate. So I want to thank you for watching for tonight. This has been Nycos Nightly, and we are going to close out with a example of the page that we provide that shows you where you can get information. If you want to know more about the Nycos RPG, check out nycosrpg.com, and that has product info and merchandising information. We also have nycosrpg.info, a site that has the story, lore, and so much more. Of course, you can join our Discord by following the link below, or reach out to us at nycosrpg on YouTube. Follow us for more stories and adventures, both here on Twitch and on our YouTube channel at Nycos RPG. And if you want to become part of our community, of course, join us at patreon.com/join/Nycos.